The beam of my flashlight caught something metallic in the corner of the basement, and my heart stopped. Three padlocks secured a wooden chest that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. My hands trembled as I reached for the first lock, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The musty air of the abandoned ranch house pressed against my lungs as I worked the rusted metal, each click echoing through the darkness like a countdown to truth. Just hours earlier, I had been standing in Sheriff Martinez's office, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I had found. The photographs, the documents, the evidence that turned my stomach and made me question everything about the inheritance that had brought me to this godforsaken place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the moment I walked out of Riverside Children's Home with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of uncertainty. My name is Sarah Evans, and at 18 I was officially aging out of the system. 12 years in foster care and group homes had taught me not to expect much from life, certainly not family. So when the letter arrived from a law office in Cedar Ridge, Montana, claiming I had inherited property from a great uncle I'd never heard of, my first instinct was to throw it away. Scams targeting vulnerable kids aging out of care weren't uncommon, but something about the letterhead looked legitimate, and the lawyer, Edward Hernandez, had included specific details about my mother's maiden name and birth records that would be hard to fake. Against my better judgment, I called the number. Edward's voice was warm and professional as he explained that my great-uncle, Samuel Peterson, had passed away 6 months ago and left me his ranch in Cedar Ridge. The property included a house, barn, and 40 acres of land, all free and clear. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets darker than I ever imagined possible, and I need you all with me for what's coming. The catch, Edward explained, was that I had to take possession within 90 days, or the property would revert to the state. I had 30 days left. He offered to wire me enough money for a bus ticket and promised to meet me at the property to handle the paperwork. Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but I was 18, homeless, and running out of options. The Greyhound bus pulled into Cedar Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late September. The town was smaller than I had imagined, just a main street lined with weathered storefronts and pickup trucks parked at angles that suggested no one was in much of a hurry. Edward was waiting for me at the depot, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. We drove through town in his pickup, past Miller's Feed Store, Rose's Diner, in the Cedar Ridge Community Center. The buildings looked like they had been there forever, solid and unpretentious. Edward pointed out landmarks and introduced me to the few people we passed, all of whom seemed to know about my arrival. News traveled fast in small towns. The Peterson Ranch sat 5 miles outside town, accessible by a gravel road that wound through rolling hills covered in golden grass. As we crested the final hill, I got my first look at my inheritance. The house was a 2-story farmhouse with white siding that had seen better days, surrounded by mature cottonwood trees that cast long shadows across the yard. The barn was red, or had been once, and looked sturdy despite its age. Edward parked near the front porch and handed me a set of keys. The weight of them in my palm felt significant, like I was holding more than just metal. For the first time in my life, I owned something substantial, something permanent. The feeling was overwhelming and terrifying. Inside, the house smelled like dust and time. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the rooms a ghostly appearance. Edward walked me through each room, explaining that Samuel had lived alone for the past 20 years after his wife died. The kitchen was spacious with a large farmhouse table. The living room had a stone fireplace, and upstairs were 3 bedrooms, including a master suite with windows overlooking the pastures. In Samuel's bedroom, Edward showed me a desk where he had left some personal papers and photographs. There were pictures of Samuel as a young man, some with a woman I assumed was his wife, and others of him working the ranch. But what caught my attention was a framed photograph on the nightstand of a young woman who looked remarkably like me. When I picked it up, Edward's expression grew serious. "That's your grandmother, Margaret," he said quietly. "She was Samuel's younger sister. She left Cedar Ridge when she was about your age and never came back. Samuel spent years trying to find her, to reconnect, but she had changed her name and disappeared completely. He only learned about you after she died, when he hired a private investigator to trace her family line. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother had run away from this place, from this family, and now I was here inheriting what she had left behind. Edward seemed to sense my confusion and suggested we continue the tour outside. The barn was impressive, with high ceilings and sturdy construction that spoke to Samuel's attention to detail. There were still hay bales stacked in the loft and farm equipment covered in tarps. Edward explained that Samuel had leased most of the land to neighboring ranchers in recent years, but the lease agreements were flexible and could be renegotiated or terminated if I wanted to work the land myself. As we walked the property, Edward's demeanor grew more cautious. He mentioned that there had been some interest in the land from developers, people who saw potential in subdividing it for residential lots. Some locals weren't thrilled about the possibility of their quiet community being transformed into a suburban development. My arrival, he suggested, might be met with mixed reactions. We returned to the house as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows. Edward helped me carry my few belongings inside and showed me where Samuel had kept basic supplies. There was enough canned food to last a few days, and the utilities were still connected. Before leaving, he handed me his business card and a folder of important documents, including Samuel's will, property deeds, and contact information for local services. That first night alone in the house was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The silence was complete, broken only by the settling sounds of old wood and the distant call of coyotes. I had never lived anywhere so quiet, so isolated. Growing up in group homes meant constant noise, shared spaces, and the presence of other people. This solitude was both liberating and frightening. I spent the evening exploring more thoroughly, opening drawers and cabinets, trying to piece together who Samuel Peterson had been. In the kitchen, I found a recipe box filled with handwritten cards, many in what I assumed was his wife's handwriting. The pantry was well stocked with home-canned vegetables and preserves, labels indicating they were several years old but probably still good. In the living room, I discovered a collection of leather-bound journals on a bookshelf. Samuel had been a meticulous record keeper, documenting everything from weather patterns to crop yields to local news. Reading his entries was like stepping into his daily life. He wrote about morning chores, visits from neighbors, concerns about drought, and celebrations of good harvests. But there were also more personal entries about loneliness, about missing his wife, and about his regret over losing touch with his sister Margaret. One entry from just 2 years ago stopped me cold. Samuel had written about hiring the private investigator and learning that Margaret had died in Denver, leaving behind a daughter who had given birth to me before dying in a car accident when I was 6. He expressed deep sorrow for the family he had never known and determination to find me, to offer me the home and stability that Margaret had never found. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. I had spent my entire life believing I had no family, no one who cared about my existence. Yet here was proof that someone had been looking for me, someone who had wanted to provide for me. The timing was cruel. Samuel had died just months before I aged out of the system, before we could meet. I barely slept that first night. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and my imagination conjured all sorts of threats. But when morning came and sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows, the house felt different, less foreign, more welcoming. I made coffee using Samuel's ancient percolator and sat on the front porch, watching the sunrise paint the hills in golden light. The next few days fell into a routine. I explored the property more thoroughly, ventured into town for groceries and supplies, and began the process of making the house truly mine. The people in Cedar Ridge were cautiously friendly. At Rosa's Diner, the owner, Maria Sanchez, served me coffee and homemade pie while sharing stories about Samuel. He had been well respected in the community, she told me, known for his generosity and reliability. But I also sensed undercurrents of concern. Conversations would pause when I entered rooms, and I caught people exchanging meaningful glances. It wasn't hostility exactly, but there was definitely uncertainty about my intentions. Edward had mentioned the development interest, and I began to understand that my presence represented a potential threat to the community's way of life. A week into my stay, I received my first visitor. Noah Brown introduced himself as Samuel's nearest neighbor, a man in his 50s with weathered hands and a direct manner of speaking. He owned the ranch to the east and had been friends with Samuel for over 20 years. Noah was clearly sizing me up, trying to determine what kind of person I was and what I planned to do with the property. We sat on the porch drinking coffee while he shared memories of Samuel and asked careful questions about my background and intentions. I found myself being more honest than I had planned, telling him about growing up in care, about my lack of farming experience, and about my uncertainty regarding the future. Something in my honesty seemed to reassure him, and his demeanor softened. Noah offered practical help, suggesting ways I could learn about ranch management and introducing me to other community members who might serve as mentors. He also warned me about the development pressure, explaining that several local landowners had been approached by a company called Mountain Vista Development with offers to purchase their property for subdivision. The company was aggressive, he said, sometimes using questionable tactics to pressure owners into selling. Samuel had refused their offers multiple times, and Noah suspected they would approach me eventually. He advised me to be cautious and to consult with Edward before making any decisions. That afternoon, Noah introduced me to Kyle Mitchell, who managed the ranch where Samuel had been leasing his grazing land. Kyle was younger, maybe in his 30s, with an easy smile and extensive knowledge of local agriculture. He offered to teach me about cattle ranching and land management, suggesting that I could continue Samuel's leasing arrangement while learning the business. The prospect of actually working the land was both exciting and intimidating. I had no experience with animals or agriculture, but something about the idea appealed to me. It felt like a way to honor Samuel's legacy while building something meaningful for myself. Over the following weeks, Kyle became my unofficial mentor. He taught me about pasture rotation, water management, and the basics of cattle care. The physical work was demanding but satisfying in a way I had never experienced. There was something deeply gratifying about accomplishing tangible tasks, about seeing immediate results from my efforts. I also began to integrate more into the community. Helen Harris, who ran the local library, helped me research the history of the Peterson Ranch and the surrounding area. I learned that Samuel's family had been among the original homesteaders in the region, that the land had been in the family for over a century. This knowledge added weight to my inheritance, making me feel like a custodian of something larger than myself. The more I learned about Samuel and the ranch, the more questions I had about my grandmother Margaret. Why had she left? What had driven her away from this place and these people who seemed so welcoming? Samuel's journals mentioned arguments with their parents and Margaret's desire for a different kind of life, but the details were vague. Helen helped me search through old newspaper archives and county records, piecing together fragments of Margaret's story. She had been a talented student, accepted to college in Denver, but her parents had expected her to stay and help with the ranch. The conflict had escalated until she left abruptly, just before her 19th birthday, leaving behind a note saying she would never return. The parallels to my own situation weren't lost on me. Here I was, 18 and facing choices about my future, just as Margaret had been. But unlike her, I was finding acceptance and opportunity in Cedar Ridge rather than restriction and conflict. The community that had perhaps seemed suffocating to a young woman in the 1960s now offered me stability and belonging. As autumn progressed, I settled into a routine that felt increasingly natural. Mornings were spent working with Kyle, learning about ranch operations, and helping with seasonal tasks like moving cattle and preparing equipment for winter. Afternoons were often dedicated to house projects, updating and personalizing the space that was becoming truly mine. The house itself seemed to welcome these changes. I painted rooms, rearranged furniture, and gradually replaced Samuel's belongings with my own choices. But I kept many of his things, particularly the photographs and journals that told the story of the land and the family I was now part of. It was during one of these house projects that I made the discovery that changed everything. I was cleaning out the basement, sorting through boxes of old papers and equipment, when I noticed that one section of the wall looked different from the rest. The boards were newer, and there were gaps that suggested they might be removable. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried at the boards with a crowbar I had found in Samuel's tool collection. Behind them was a small space, almost like a hidden room, containing several wooden crates and metal boxes. My heart pounded as I realized I had found something Samuel had deliberately concealed. The first crate contained old photographs and documents, family records dating back to the original homestead. But as I dug deeper, the contents became more disturbing. There were photographs of people I didn't recognize, some appearing to be taken without their knowledge. There were maps with locations marked, and notebooks filled with observations about individuals' daily routines and habits. At the bottom of the largest crate, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a collection of driver's licenses, all from young women, all bearing different names but showing faces that looked remarkably similar to mine, to the photograph of my grandmother Margaret that I had seen upstairs. My hands shook as I examined each license. The women ranged in age from 16 to 25, and the licenses were from different states and time periods spanning nearly 30 years. Some of the names were crossed out in red ink with dates written beside them. The dates, I realized with growing horror, might be death dates. I sat back on my heels trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't random photographs or documents. This was a collection, organized and maintained over decades. And all of these women looked like they could be related to me, like they shared the same bloodline that connected me to Margaret and Samuel. With trembling fingers, I opened one of the metal boxes. Inside were more personal items, jewelry and small mementos that might have belonged to the women in the photographs. Each item was labeled with a date and location. The methodical organization was terrifying in its implications. I forced myself to continue searching, knowing that I needed to understand the full scope of what I had discovered. In the final box, I found a journal written in Samuel's handwriting, but unlike the daily records I had read upstairs, this one detailed something far darker. The entries described Samuel's obsession with finding women who reminded him of Margaret, his belief that he could somehow replace the sister who had abandoned him by collecting surrogates. He wrote about following these women, learning their routines, and in some cases, approaching them under false pretenses. The journal entries became increasingly disturbed as they progressed through the years. Samuel described his frustration when the women didn't live up to his expectations, when they proved to be different from his idealized memory of Margaret. Some entries suggested that his disappointment had led to violence. I felt sick as I read his descriptions of multiple murders, all carefully planned and executed to avoid detection. Samuel had used his knowledge of the remote ranch land to dispose of bodies, and his standing in the community had protected him from suspicion. He had been living a double life for decades, presenting himself as a respected rancher while secretly preying on vulnerable young women. The final entries in the journal were the most chilling. Samuel had written about hiring the private investigator, not just to find Margaret's family, but specifically to locate me. He had seen my photograph in the investigator's report and become convinced that I was the perfect replacement for Margaret, the one who would finally fulfill his twisted fantasy. But Samuel had died before he could act on these plans, leaving me to inherit not just his property, but the evidence of his crime. I realized that I was likely the intended final victim in his collection, the granddaughter he had never met but had planned to destroy. I stumbled upstairs, my mind reeling from the implications. The house that had begun to feel like home now seemed contaminated by the knowledge of what Samuel had done. Every room held new menace. Every shadow could be hiding more evidence of his depravity. But as the initial shock wore off, I realized that I had a responsibility to act. These women deserved justice and their families deserved answers. I couldn't simply pretend I hadn't found the evidence. Couldn't let Samuel's crimes remain hidden. I called Edward first, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I had discovered. His shocked silence told me that he had no knowledge of Samuel's dark secret. As a lawyer, he advised me to contact law enforcement immediately and to avoid disturbing the evidence any further. Sheriff Martinez arrived within an hour, accompanied by 2 deputies and a crime scene investigator. Julie Carter, the investigator, was thorough and professional as she documented the hidden room and its contents. She explained that the West likely involved multiple jurisdictions, given that the crimes appeared to span several states and decades. The sheriff was a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense attitude and kind eyes. She sat with me in the kitchen while her team worked, asking gentle questions about my discovery and my relationship to Samuel. I explained that I had never met him, that I had only learned of his existence when I inherited the ranch. As the investigation unfolded over the following days, the scope of Samuel's crimes became clear. The FBI was called in to coordinate with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Several of the women in the photographs were matched to cold cases, missing person reports that had gone unsolved for years. The media attention was overwhelming. Reporters descended on Cedar Ridge, transforming the quiet town into a circus of news vans and camera crews. The story of the respected rancher who had been a serial killer for decades shocked the community and made national headlines. I found myself at the center of the storm, the young woman who had inherited a house of horrors. Some reporters painted me as a victim, while others suggested I might have known about Samuel's crimes. The speculation was painful and invasive, forcing me to relive my discovery over and over again. The community's reaction was complex. Many people felt betrayed and horrified that someone they had trusted had been capable of such evil. Others directed their anger and suspicion toward me, as if my presence had somehow brought this darkness to light. The welcome I had begun to feel in Cedar Ridge evaporated under the weight of association with Samuel's crimes. Noah Brown was one of the few who continued to treat me with kindness. He understood that I was as much a victim of Samuel's deception as anyone else, that I had come to Cedar Ridge seeking family and found only horror. His support helped me navigate the worst days of the investigation. Kyle Mitchell also stood by me, helping to care for the property while I dealt with legal proceedings and media attention. The cattle still needed tending, the land still required management, regardless of the chaos surrounding the house. Their practical support reminded me that life continued even in the midst of tragedy. The investigation took months to complete. FBI agents excavated sections of the ranch, searching for burial sites mentioned in Samuel's journal. They found remains of 3 women on the property, victims whose disappearances had puzzled law enforcement for years. Each discovery brought fresh media attention and renewed trauma for the families involved. I struggled with the decision of whether to stay in Cedar Ridge or leave everything behind. The house felt tainted by Samuel's crimes, and the community's mixed reaction made me question whether I could ever truly belong there. But something kept me from running, perhaps the same stubbornness that had helped me survive the foster care system. Edward helped me understand my legal options. As Samuel's heir, I owned the property free and clear, but I also inherited the moral weight of his actions. We discussed donating the land to the victims' families or selling it and giving the proceeds to organizations that help missing persons cases. But as I considered these options, I realized that running away wouldn't honor the memory of Samuel's victims or help heal the community's wounds. Instead, I began to envision a different kind of legacy, one that could transform the site of so much pain into something positive. Working with Edward and several community leaders, I developed a plan to convert part of the ranch into a memorial garden for Samuel's victims and a resource center for families of missing persons. The house would be demolished, but the land would serve a purpose that honored those who had suffered rather than the man who had caused their pain. The proposal was controversial. Some community members felt that any memorial would be a constant reminder of the town's darkest chapter. Others worried about continued media attention and its impact on tourism and property values. But many people, particularly the families of Samuel's victims, supported the idea of creating something meaningful from the tragedy. Helen Harris became one of my strongest allies in this effort. As the librarian, she understood the importance of preserving difficult histories rather than hiding from them. She helped me research similar memorial projects and connect with organizations that could provide guidance and funding. The process of planning the memorial brought me into contact with the families of Samuel's victims. These meetings were emotionally difficult, but also healing. I was able to share what I had learned about Samuel's methods and timeline, helping to answer questions that had haunted these families for years. Maria Martinez, whose daughter had been one of Samuel's early victims, became particularly important to me. Despite her own grief, she recognized that I was also a victim of Samuel's manipulation, that he had intended to harm me just as he had harmed her daughter. Her forgiveness and support helped me find the strength to continue with the memorial project. Construction of the memorial garden began the following spring. The house was demolished first, a process that felt both liberating and sad. Despite everything, it had been my first real home, the place where I had begun to imagine a different kind of life. But its destruction was necessary for healing, both for the community and for myself. The garden design incorporated native plants and walking paths that led to individual memorial stones for each of Samuel's identified victims. At the center was a larger monument bearing the names of all the women and a commitment to never forget their stories. The Resource Center was built as a separate structure, designed to blend with the landscape while providing meeting space and research facilities for families dealing with missing persons cases. Working on the memorial project gave me a sense of purpose that helped me process my own trauma. I learned about landscape design, project management, and nonprofit administration. More importantly, I found ways to channel my anger and grief into something constructive. The community's attitude toward me began to shift as they saw my commitment to honoring Samuel's victims rather than profiting from my inheritance. People who had initially been suspicious started to offer support and assistance. Local contractors donated labor, businesses provided materials at cost, and volunteers helped with landscaping and construction. Kyle Mitchell remained a constant source of support throughout this process. Our working relationship had evolved into something deeper, a friendship based on shared values and mutual respect. He helped me understand that healing didn't require forgetting, that it was possible to acknowledge darkness while choosing to create light. The Memorial Garden opened 2 years after my arrival in Cedar Ridge. The dedication ceremony was attended by victims' families, community members, law enforcement officials, and representatives from missing persons organizations. It was an emotional day, filled with tears and remembrance, but also with hope for the future. Standing before the gathered crowd, I spoke about the responsibility that comes with inheriting someone else's legacy, both the good and the evil. I talked about the choice we all have to either perpetuate cycles of harm or work to break them. The Memorial Garden represented our collective commitment to choosing healing over hatred, remembrance over forgetting. In the months that followed, the Resource Center began serving families from across the region. We provided research assistance, emotional support, and advocacy services for people dealing with missing persons cases. The work was difficult but meaningful, transforming the site of Samuel's crimes into a place of hope and healing. My own healing continued as well. I remained in Cedar Ridge, purchasing a small house in town while maintaining the Memorial Garden and Resource Center. The community that had initially viewed me with suspicion gradually accepted me as one of their own, recognizing that I had chosen to stay and work for positive change rather than running from difficulty. Noah Brown became like a father to me, teaching me about ranching and rural life while providing the steady presence I had never had growing up. Helen Harris continued to be a mentor and friend, helping me navigate the complexities of nonprofit management and community leadership. Even Maria Sanchez, who had initially been cautious around me, eventually welcomed me into her extended family of regular customers and friends. The relationship with Kyle deepened into love, built on a foundation of shared work and mutual support through crisis. He understood my past in ways that others couldn't, having witnessed my transformation from a frightened 18-year-old into someone capable of leading a community healing process. Our relationship felt different from anything I had imagined, grounded in reality rather than fantasy. 3 years after arriving in Cedar Ridge, I stood in the Memorial Garden on a quiet morning, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. The memorial stones were surrounded by blooming wildflowers, and the Resource Center showed signs of active use. Families continued to find comfort and assistance there, turning their pain into purpose just as I had learned to do. I thought about Margaret, my grandmother, who had run from this place seeking a different life. I wondered what she would think of my choice to stay, to plant roots in the soil she had rejected. Perhaps she would understand that sometimes running away is necessary, but sometimes standing and fighting is the braver choice. The irony wasn't lost on me that Samuel's twisted plan to replace Margaret with me had, in a way, succeeded. I had become the Peterson family member who stayed, who took responsibility for the land and the legacy. But instead of fulfilling his dark fantasies, I had transformed his inheritance into something that honored his victims and served the community. I had also found the family I had always been searching for, not in blood relations, but in the chosen connections that had sustained me through crisis. Noah, Helen, Kyle, Maria, and countless others had become my family through shared commitment and mutual care. They had taught me that belonging isn't something you inherit, but something you create through daily choices and actions. The Memorial Garden had become more than just a monument to Samuel's victims. It was a symbol of the community's resilience, proof that even the darkest chapters could be transformed into sources of strength and healing. Visitors often commented on the sense of peace they found there, the way beauty could coexist with remembrance of tragedy. Looking back now, 5 years after that first bus ride to Cedar Ridge, I can see how every choice led to this moment. The decision to answer Edward's letter, to trust in the possibility of family, to stay despite the horror of what I discovered, to choose healing over hatred. Each step had been necessary to become the person I was meant to be. The Resource Center continues to serve families across the region, and we've expanded our services to include support groups and educational programs about personal safety. The Memorial Garden has become a place of pilgrimage for people dealing with loss, a reminder that love can triumph over evil when communities choose to stand together. I still live in Cedar Ridge, now married to Kyle and expecting our first child. The baby will grow up knowing the full story of how their parents met, how love grew from shared commitment to justice and healing. They'll understand that family isn't just about blood, but about the people who choose to love and support each other through life's challenges. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Samuel had lived, if I had arrived at the ranch to meet him instead of discovering his crimes. The thought still sends chills down my spine, but I try not to dwell on alternate histories. Instead, I focus on the life I've built from the ashes of his evil, the good that has grown from ground once tainted by violence. The story of my inheritance has been told in documentaries and true crime podcasts, but those versions never capture the full complexity of what it means to transform trauma into purpose. They focus on the sensational aspects of Samuel's crimes rather than the harder work of healing that came afterward. That's why I wanted to tell you this story myself, in my own words. I wanted you to understand that even the darkest inheritances can be transformed if we're willing to do the work. That family isn't something you're born into, but something you create through love and commitment. That home isn't a place, but a feeling of belonging that comes from being truly known and accepted. If you're watching this and you've dealt with your own difficult family legacy, know that you have the power to choose what you carry forward. You can honor the good while refusing to perpetuate the harm. You can create the family and home you've always wanted, even if it looks nothing like what you expected. I'd love to hear about your own experiences with family, belonging, and finding home at unexpected places. Share your stories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about overcoming adversity and building meaningful lives. Sometimes the most broken inheritances can become the strongest foundations for something beautiful. The Memorial Garden taught me that remembrance and hope can coexist, that we can acknowledge darkness while choosing to create light. Every day, I get to wake up in a place where I belong, surrounded by people who chose to love me, not despite my complicated history, but because of how I chose to respond to it. That's the real inheritance Samuel left me. Not property or money, but the opportunity to prove that love is always stronger than evil.